Viewers, welcome to Radio Metro Mail, and you are watching Chit Chat. Today, I am having a very special guest with me, a beautiful young lady. She used to work for a non-for-profit. She is basically a teacher. She works for a number of non-for-profit organizations. Most recently, she was working for a not-for-profit organization where she was advocating for outdoor plays for children. She briefly worked for United Nations as well. She is having very exciting life. That's why we thought that we should bring her here as our guest. Today, we will be talking about her perspective about COVID-19, the coronavirus that has impacted our life everywhere across the world. Dear viewers, our today's guest is Catherine Stories. Catherine, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well, Aman. How are you?
I am fine, thank you very much. And I am seeing you after over almost 10 years, right?
Absolutely. It's been a really long time, but it's great to hear your face and hear your voice.
That's right. I feel like giving you a big hug after 10 years, but we are maintaining social distancing and we are on Zoom, so we can't do that, right?
Right? Hopefully in another part of the world in another time.
Right. Definitely. We are very hopeful about that. So, you know that this program, in this show, we usually talk about our COVID experience, COVID-19 that has, impacting our life in many ways from different perspectives. So we'll come to that, the COVID-19 experience. But before going into that, I know that, I was telling my viewers that, which part of Australia you live in. We'll come to that later. So you live in a very nice, quiet, small town. Let's start with that, tell us something about your township. Where do you live?
So to put it into context, we're in the Northern Territory in Australia, and we're in northeast Arnhem Land, which is in the northeast tip of the Northern Territory. We're a very small mining town, and we're incredibly isolated. So the only way to access the community is either to drive down a 700-kilometre unsealed road or to come in by plane. And even during COVID-19 times, you still need a permit to go down that track to access the town, because we're also the gateway to a lot of Aboriginal Australian Indigenous communities.
Okay, that's great. So you were telling me last time that you were sailing on a small boat, right, for 2 years, more than 2 years, and still probably you are living on a boat or what?
So we've moved off the boat, and in fact, I met my husband in Bangladesh.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I didn't know that.
Yes, it took us quite a number of years before we became a couple, and he was a sailor. And basically, it came with the package. He said, if you're interested in being my partner, you have to move aboard a very small sailing boat. And so we did that for many years, and then finally we left Australian shores and we went travelling for 2 years. And then in Fiji, we decided to have a baby. So that brought us back to Australia.
Oh, that's great. Viewers, let me just tell you one story that she said that her married life started in Bangladesh. So now she's a mother of 2 and she lives in Australia in a small territory, right, in a small township in Australia. We'll talk about her environment more because she did her master's in international development and environment analysis. I think with regard to the environment where you are living right now currently, so tell us about the natural environment of that place.
Oh, we live in one of the most extraordinarily stunning landscapes. And I think as an Australian, when you travel around Australia, often you don't actually get to experience real Australian bushland because we're a colonised country. A lot of that bushland has been cleared. The traditional Aboriginal methods for managing that land has changed over the time. A lot of that knowledge has either been restricted from being implemented or has been lost. But we live in this incredible region of East Arnhem Land, and the wildlife is incredible. Down the road from us is a permanent lagoon. It's one of the most permanent freshwater sources in Australia in terms of wetlands historically. We have brolgas, which probably doesn't mean anything to your international audience, but they're these incredible crane-like birds that do this dance. And we also get this migration of magpie geese each year. Because it's quite a small town, a lot of people entertain themselves by going camping and fishing. And even though we've moved to land, we have a little trailer sailor boat, and we actually spent the weekend camping out on one of the islands here, and the kids got to play in the sand. The big thing is we do have crocodiles, and as a mother, that puts a lot of burden because I have to supervise the kids all of the time because they would be a very, very tasty snack for a saltwater crocodile. But as an Australian, I feel really privileged. This area is incredible savanna, and I feel sad that I could grow up in Australia and not realise that this amazing bushland used to occupy so much of our land. And we also have these wildflower fields that really, because of the introduction of grazing animals and changes in fire regimes, traditionally the Indigenous people would have burnt the land to maintain it, and fire is very scary to Westerners, so a lot of those practices died out. And because we are in this incredibly privileged and fortunate position to be in East Arnhem Land, we can see these incredible flower fields. And I wish it's not just, it's not just a foreign concept to people from outside of Australia. I think a lot of Australians don't really understand what this bushland is meant to look like.
No, that's great. So it seems that, both of you met your husband in Bangladesh, right? While you were working for United Nations briefly, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm sure that you must be having some, interesting stories about Bangladesh. Can you remember something, or do you like to share something?
Definitely. I mean, it was for... I think it may have even been 13 years ago now. It was a long time ago, and it was my real. I was a young Australian who just finished her undergraduate degree. I found myself in this incredible, colourful place. I met lovely people like you and your wife, and my whole eyes were open to a different world, and a world of beautiful colour. And I suppose years and years later, what really still sticks in my mind is that imagery of the massive waves of people coming to work in the fabric factories with their incredibly beautiful outfits that kind of with their scarves blowing behind them in the wind, which I always thought looked so incredibly elegant. And the fact that, there's no way that Australian trucks would be painted in such an extraordinary way like they are in Bangladesh. And I think that it's a loss for the rest of the world that we don't understand that we should be painting our trucks with a little more artistry. And the landscape, that beautiful green rolling landscape that hits the sky. And then, of course, because I have that environmental blame, I think it's a real human need to be connected to our landscape and our environment and have a sense of place. I really loved the fact that the word for river dolphins, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the word for children as well.
That's right. That's right, yeah.
And that you have what are incredibly, to a certain extent, quite polluted rivers that have travelled so far, and they still have these beautiful dolphins that are, living in them and swimming in them, and you can take your boat up and see them swimming around. So it really did open my eyes to an incredible part of the world.
So that was the first time you were out from Australia abroad, or you visited other countries before Bangladesh?
So I'd been to India before, and I had been to Malaysia. So I've done a little bit of travel, but there's a very big difference between traveling somewhere as a tourist and living and working and having local colleagues and really getting to know a place over time. And I think as someone coming in from overseas, we often have assumptions and answers to everything. And then over time, we just realize that we don't know anything and we should just embrace that.
Yes, so I'm sure that, you know, Bangladesh, you won't be able to forget Bangladesh in your life because you met your life partner in Bangladesh, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. It did take us many years to get together. We were just friends at that point. But
okay, so you tell us, how did you meet your husband in Bangladesh and where?
So actually at a party. My husband's brother was also an Australian volunteer in Bangladesh for an NGO, and his parents couldn't come and visit, so they had sent his brother instead. And so I met this young man at a party. We only met for a few brief seconds, and then I had to go home. But our paths kept on crossing during his visit, and in fact, we spent a day going around Old Dhaka. We went on the river together. We went to the market, but we also went to, we found, because my husband's a sailor, those incredible things that come off the shipbreaking yards really held a lot of fascination between him. So we went and we bought a sextant, which is a navigational equipment that had come off an old Russian ship, and we still have that together. Like, we still have that sextant, and of course and so that was a beautiful shared experience that we had, that we can still talk about years after we're still together.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think it's good to know that, you know, you met your life partner in Bangladesh and you are carrying on. And you told me that you were sailing with on a boat which is very small. How small it is? Can you just give us some idea about the boat?
A 30-foot sailboat, which in terms of cruising sailboats is definitely on the small scale. It was a little red thing. And if you can imagine a cartoon of a boat that a child would draw, that's very similar to what our boat looked like. It was red with little round portholes, and it was actually based on an 18th century design. So it was a gaff rig boat. It was very safe, but very slow. But we used to call it kind of the boating equivalent of a combi van or a floating cottage. And
so do you have a photograph of that boat, or still you are having that one, or no?
I can definitely share it with you. And we did sell her. So her name was Snufkin, which is after a finished children's book of a global wanderer.
Okay.
But we did sell her, and it was quite a heartbreaking thing to part with her at the end. And so now we have a tiny little trailer sailor called Duckling.
We'd love to see that, you know, the photo of that boat.
Then I can definitely share it with you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Kat, you were saying that with regard to the COVID-19, the coronavirus, so how is your province or the small township, the mining township where you live in? So how the province is doing with regard to COVID-19?
So we've been incredibly fortunate, both as a family and as a region. There are no active cases of COVID-19 in the Northern Territory. And there's strong border controls between the Northern Territory and the more populated states that have had higher levels of COVID-19. And also because the population here is seen as being quite vulnerable if a case of COVID got into the community, the federal government actually created a biosecurity zone around our community, which restricts movements into the biosecurity zone and also around the biosecurity zone. So that will lift in 2 weeks' time. And because of the fact that we are so isolated and those restrictions in movement have been so successful, a lot of the social distancing restrictions have now lifted. I send my child to preschool. I can send my daughter to daycare. We go to the swimming pool. We can go camping. Even the pubs have opened again, although there's certain rules that we have to follow. But in March, we were really bracing for the worst. So because of the Indigenous population here and the Indigenous communities, there are a lot of reasons why that community is quite vulnerable. And actually during the swine flu, the community was quite disproportionately affected compared to the general Australian population. So, for example, we have a small district hospital, which is lovely, but it's not really geared like any regional hospital. It isn't geared up to dealing with a pandemic. It doesn't have the abilities to cater for large numbers of people needing ventilation. There's both cultural and physical barriers to the Indigenous people accessing healthcare. We also have more crowded housing conditions, and then a greater number of people suffering from underlying health conditions. So in March, when it really looked like things were going to go very badly in Australia, there was a lot of fear that this community was going to be in an awful lot of trouble. And one way it was described is that the community ran the risk of losing an entire generation of Indigenous elders. And of course, because my husband's a nurse, we were having conversations at home about what it would be like if he ended up on the front line and how we would cope as a family.
So you were telling that, the people in your township they are quite vulnerable. So what is the reason for the vulnerability? Why do you think that they are quite vulnerable?
Well, I think that there's a lot of, and I think this impacts Indigenous communities globally.
Okay.
There's a lot of things that make them probably more vulnerable than the general population. One would be the poor health statistics. Indigenous people in Australia have a much shorter life expectancy than the general population. There's a lot more conditions like diabetes and heart disease that are within the communities. Another reason they're vulnerable is their elderly actually live within the communities, whereas generally in the white Australian community, our elderly and most vulnerable are actually in nursing homes. They're a lot easier to quarantine. I'm not saying that that's a good thing in any way, shape or form. Then there's barriers in terms of poor experiences with formal healthcare in the past, cultural barriers, and then huge barriers of distance. So some of these communities, the Hnulubuy, which is we're a mining town and we're a gateway to a lot of these Indigenous communities, but these Indigenous communities are then further down, dirt tracks, very, very remote, and then there's the islands off the community. So the hospital covers a huge distance in the East Arnhem region.
Okay, we understand that because of their the lifestyle, basically they are quite vulnerable, right?
Yes, absolutely. And then the history of the compound disadvantage that a lot of these communities have suffered after colonization.
Okay, but it's good thing that you guys are quite protected by the province. So you do not have any positive cases yet, right?
No, not at all. And I think that we are really, really fortunate. But we are at the beginning of the journey. So the biosecurity zones that I mentioned earlier, they're actually been lifted in 2 weeks' time. Yeah. The Chief Minister of the Northern Territory has been quite adamant that they'll lift a lot of the restrictions in the Northern Territory, but they won't lift the borders. So okay. the restrictions on the borders, which on a personal level, although they have been quite controversial, I'm very, very happy about.
Okay, Kat, let us talk about something, the COVID-19 very specifically, because across the world, we all are suffering. We are, this COVID-19 pandemic is impacting on our personal life, our social life, our career, everywhere, our economy. So with regard to that, so has the whole situation given you a new thought, or you started thinking new, which you never ever thought about?
Oh, definitely. I think that the situation of COVID-19 has allowed me to reflect on and be thankful for what I do have and what we've had as a family. I think as a society, we really value formal work, and we often attach our identities to our employment. And in February this year, I left my job to spend more time with my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old. And I think that COVID-19 has given us a great opportunity to reflect and value family. And I think it's the first time, I think that stay-at-home mums, especially ones who've had an established career, often get confronted by the idea that they're putting on their lives on hold for their children, and that even though the job of a mother is very valuable, I think it's undervalued by society. And I think that this period has just given us permission to really value family and motherhood again. And I have never felt more comfortable and happy in my role as a mum. And so and I really feel that the situation with COVID-19 may have actually really contributed to that psychology of the situation. And I really am really loving being a mum and being at home. And I suppose I miss my family because of the border restrictions. They can't come and visit. And so when you're deprived of something, you start to realise just how important it is to you. And Australians, I think in general, are starting to really reflect on the basics, how we grow our food, where we grow our food. Heaps of Australians have started veggie gardens. You couldn't buy seeds in the shops for a couple of months because they'd all been bought out, because you couldn't buy egg-laying chickens either. Everyone had got backyard chickens. People are reflecting on, how much they value medical care, and the fact that we have to a certain extent, we have universal medical care in Australia, and where we would go if we needed it, and who in the family is most likely to need it. And that reflection on the basics is really important. And I think we're also, if you're fortunate enough, and not everyone has been fortunate enough to take this time as a breather, some people still have to go to work. Some people, if they don't work, we have a good social safety net in Australia, but in other parts of the world, if you don't work, you starve. But if you are fortunate enough to take that time to be able to reflect, that is so very valuable, and we really need to be thankful for it.
Yeah, thank you, Kit. I think you said that though many of us, we are suffering, we are having difficult time, we are passing through many challenges. But despite all these things, I think it has given us some kind of opportunity to reflect back. The reflection you're talking about is that to, look back and see, what strength or we have within us. That is very important as well, right?
Definitely.
And with regard to environment as well, that has given us some kind of, clue or indication or directive that, we should also, take care of our environment, our surrounding as well.
Definitely. We need to prepare for the future, and we need to listen to experts in terms of what we could face in the future.
Thank you. So many of us, many people, they are saying that, after COVID, we know that the challenge we are facing right now, the difficulties we are having right now, we shall overcome, and definitely will have a good time in near future. But many of our friends, our colleagues, people around us, they are saying that after COVID, post-COVID, the world will not be the same. What do you think about that? What is your take?
Oh, I think it's already changed significantly. I think as a traveller, I think international travel won't be the same for a really long time. So, as you know, David and I travelled around the Pacific for that 2 years, and we used to joke when we were on passage, because sometimes you're on passage for up to a month, that the world could end and we wouldn't know. We wouldn't see any other people. We'd just be in the ocean, bobbing along in our meditative state, watching the weather. But what's interesting is that's exactly what's happened to some of our sailing friends. They've left to go on a passage before they even thought or knew about COVID-19, and they have arrived in a country where the world has completely changed. They've gone to, go through customs and anchor or moor their boat and get fresh food after 25 days at sea, to be confronted by guns and a very, very, unwelcoming situation where people are quite fearful of people coming from outside, and they've had to grapple with this. There's sailors all around the world that are trapped in the locations that they're in, unable to move, with a hurricane season coming.
Yeah.
And I just don't know. I can't see that being the same for many years to come. I think that whole cruising life and life of exploring and visiting countries will be very, very different.
So there will be a lot of changes, definitely. But since we are talking about, COVID-19 post situation, I have another question for you. But before that, I'd like to know one thing about, isolation is a new word. It's not a new word, but it is very popular word now, that because we are isolated from, the community members, from family, greater family, and we are maintaining social distance. So this is having some kind of negative impact on many people, because they are not habituated to be alone within themselves or within their intimate family. They want to go, they want to eat together, they want to pray together, they want to go for party with friends, but they are not allowed to go now these days. So that is, putting a lot of pressure on many people. But the question is that you were in ocean for many years. Many years means more than around 2 years, right? Almost.
Yep. So we were out almost 2 years.
2 years. So you have kind of experience of isolation. But when you were in the ocean, it's only yourself and your husband, or you have?
No, it was only the two of us together.
That's right. So how long was that?
So I think our longest passage where we were out at sea together was 28 days, and that was between the Marshall Islands and a small island called Wallis, which is a French protectorate in the Pacific. So we're very used to each other's company. So we're isolated but in each other's company. And I think when we came back to Australia, I'd spent vast days where I was no more than 3 meters away from this human being. It was actually quite strange when we had to act like normal people, and one of us went to work while the other went to another job. But we were used to isolation, and I was used to taking a deep breath and realizing that depending on the weather, the next 30 days would be completely out of our control, and we just had to see where the weather and the boat took us. And I think, so I got very used to almost entering a little bit of a meditative state where you just accepted what was coming, because also if you get into a heightened emotional state in those periods of isolation, it's actually incredibly dangerous because nobody can help you. So, and you're surrounded by ocean. So you need to be very, very calm and receptive to what might come next. I think it really helped. Into motherhood.
That's great. So those who we are not habituated with this kind of isolation, and we feel that, we feel additional pressure with regard to this isolation. So do you have any specific tips within, being in isolation, how we can keep calm, strong, and how we can stay healthy? Do you have any tips for that?
Oh, absolutely. On a pragmatic level, make sure that you have a Kindle or a lot of really good books. I think I read a book a day while we were traveling, and I'm not a fast reader, but it was just constant. Make sure that even if you're physically isolated from others, that you're not isolated from your environment and your landscape. This is a great time to set your alarm, go and see where the moon is in the sky each day, how it's, waxing and waning, get really in touch with the seasons, because I think it's a part of human nature that's been neglected for a long time, but it's really good for your mental health. Hobbies are important, but the thing is human beings, especially with particular personalities, we're not necessarily designed to do hobbies alone. I've never embraced technology so much. I'm not really a fan of Zoom conversations, and yet here we are having one now. And we had a Zoom dinner party with my Easter with my family. We had isolated birthday parties for my 2-year-old and my 4-year-old, and my husband also turned 40. So really embracing that technology. But I suppose on a boat, we couldn't. We had to really ration our technology. If we sent something out over the satellite, we had to be very careful that it was very succinct, that there wasn't many words and definitely no images. So we did get very used to valuing that communication and how we communicated with others.
So it seems that in near future, in coming days, we have to embrace a lot of new things and new technology. Even our social ritual will also be different. So we have to accept all these things, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think that some of those physical social rituals, they're so instinctual and so ingrained in us that whereas I see lots of things changing, I can't imagine that we won't start hugging again. And I'm sure that the French will still kiss each other on the cheeks. It's just so ingrained in us all.
That's what, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Kate. So I think we are we'll wrap up our show. But before we leave, the last question, since there is an opportunity now, because we started thinking about a different world, definitely we'll expect that we will have a better world. So, or do you have any specific dream? What do you think that, what would be your dream world look like?
Oh, absolutely. So I really hope that there's a lesson from this about the importance of looking after your most vulnerable, that we learn as a society to care for and respect our elders in a way that we haven't really done in the past. I would like to see stronger social safety nets and a sense of social justice in terms of looking after each other. I would like to see a greater connection with the environment and our earth, and also a collaboration. You know, I think that there's going to be a temptation to fold into ourselves as nations and as families, but a collaboration of information, listening to each other and taking on some of the big challenges together. I would like to see us really get the whole upcoming crisis in relation to climate change under control and really reconnect with our planet.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So before we leave again, if you have anything specific for our audience, you are most welcome to share that one. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. What do you think?
Oh, I think I'm happy to wrap it up, but it's very, very good to see your face again.
Same here, Catherine. Thank you. Okay?
Thank you, ma'am. See you soon.
Okay, thank you. See you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.